Hello, everyone, and today we're going to talk about another fun topic, which is writing and narrative through a game. And I always think that all the fun stuff kind of happens in the beginning of a game. In the early stages, we get to think about all these wonderful things like story, gameplay, what type of game we're going to make. And then later on, we have the bugs that we have to take care of, mistakes we've made that we have to figure out: do we cover up for, or do we just get rid of that, or do we redo that? And sometimes it can give us a little bit of a, yeah, I guess, inaccurate view of the way game making is. But the nice thing is that we can talk about all this kind of cool, fun stuff right away. The reason why I'm telling you this is I kind of want to make sure that I introduce the mechanics of gameplay, or not gameplay, of storytelling in this case, in such a way that you kind of understand not just how to do it, but how to fuse it into your game using the engine. So that's why I'm starting here with the storytelling engine, because it's a little bit more boring, but we'll kind of have this in the back of our mind when we actually do make a story, so that later on we're not super frustrated with the output, or the need to make multiple edits. Okay, so let's take a look at just the storytelling engine. Now, are there a lot of storytelling engines out there? No. There are a lot of incomplete ones. There are some add-on ones, but a lot of times you don't get like, I don't know, some type of game engine that has a storytelling engine fused into it. The best storytelling engines I've seen are kind of for story games, that aren't really interested in anything other than maybe an adventure game or something that's just going to be so thematic laid. So a lot of times you end up building it into a game through your game engine, but it's not necessarily a clear path. So on this very first slide, you're going to see the word trigger a couple times. And really what all this is saying is that if an event occurs, like a person clicking on something, that's going to trigger a response, with a left mouse click, or, A on the controller. This could be movement, could be clicking on a non-playing character, whatever. And there's going to be triggers going in and triggers coming out of our game engine. So that first bullet talks about, okay, your character's moving around, and it's slowly, and as he's interacting with his environment, it's talking to the game engine. Likewise, there's going to be triggers coming out of it. So, if I have a trigger, let's say now, all of a sudden, as I use the crossover bridge, we're going to set a scene in motion to create that narration. So in other words, that's a trigger that's coming from the game engine and then going to be projected out. So this is what a simple storytelling engine will do for you. It is down here at the bottom left, and as you can see, the triggers go back and forth. Now the player only is going to see this layer, this user interface, with the visual outputs, maybe the sound outputs, and then the inputs of keyboard, controller, whatever. The triggers, like I said, happen behind here and might set forth a cutscene, but it also might just set forth somebody interacting in game. So like a character walking towards you and is about to come over and talk to you about something. So it could be a simple dialogue box that comes up. And then the events, you always try to think of this in terms of object-oriented programming, where you kind of have an event and then an event handler. So an event means anything that can happen, and your game engine is constantly listening for that. Then if something does happen, like you click on an NPC character, then all of a sudden the core mechanics take over, which is essentially the game engine. And if you build a story engine into with the game engine, they kind of become one large game engine down here. But like I say before, they're always kind of separate. You kind of build these side by side. There's not a lot of interwoven ones. But once that event is created, it's handled, and then some subroutine, sub program runs, and then starts talking back to the player. So let's talk about stories in general. The one that probably gets the most beatings over the head is the linear story. But it's not necessarily the worst, or it's not necessarily always bad. Let's put it that way. Because linear stories have one thing that the other stories don't have, which is it can bring you to an emotional response that is pretty powerful. And the best way to demonstrate that is not a game. It's actually looking at a movie or a TV show. If a great writer can bring you along a journey, and I don't know, the big thing nowadays is like they'll kill somebody off and you'll be like, but ultimately they can bring you to something where it's so profound that they had to kind of handcraft you to that place. With other types of storytelling where it isn't linear, people can go off and kind of, I don't know, play in the mud a little bit, and they're going to respond as they want to respond. But they might never get to, a build-up of a specific character that is unique and interesting and really has an impact in how the story's played out. So that's the good news. The bad news is that, obviously you're on a rail, and you can have something that isn't well received because people are always like, well, I don't want to go here, or I don't want to talk to this person, but you have to. From a game maker's standpoint, linear stories are great because, as this bullet says, there's less things that can go wrong here, and you don't have to worry about every contingency. I know, making role-playing games in the past that you can have a quest where you think when they're going to take this on and finish it, but if they don't, then all of a sudden this character who gets killed off is like standing next to your main character in the final act. Is like, oh, this dude's dead. Why is he still here? Because oh crap, they did this quest after the 24th hour of gameplay. I was expecting them to finish this right away. Why didn't we close that out right away? Okay, so there's good and bad stuff to each. Okay, now, so what happens if you don't want to do a nonlinear story? And you would think there's just linear and nonlinear, but really, if you look at the nonlinears, there's different types of nonlinear stories. One of which is the branching story. This is good, so you can go out and make a bunch of decisions. And this always works well, because I've played games like in the past like this. I would say older games were more likely to have a branching story than nowadays games, but it's hard to say because percentage-wise, I would say there's more. It was bigger, but nowadays there's so many games out there that probably are technically more branching stories. They're just a smaller percentage of the games because there's so many games being made right now. But the branching story is like you can have any ending you want. If you've ever read those books where you make a decision and then it says go to page 14 if you did this and go to page 48 if you did that. That's kind of what it does, and then it ends up giving you your unique piece. As a game maker, they can be kind of frustrating because let's say, and I shouldn't say frustrating, but it's hard when you have a really successful game and all of a sudden you're doing the sequel, because at that point, which branch do you respect? We had 12 different endings to our game. The next game is going to pick off where this leaves off, but unfortunately 7 of those branches will not mix with each other. That's the issue there. But they're really satisfying if you're, doing good and evil, lawful, chaotic, that sort of thing. It really allows people to have a lot of choices in there. So the answer to this is doing a full backstory. So in other words, everybody can branch out and do whatever the heck they want, but at some point we come back to the same spot. So in other words, I can befriend these guys over here, or I can make them my enemy and steal their stuff or something like that. But at a certain point in the story, these guys go away. They're either killed, or you move to another part of area of the map, and you're never going to see them again. All of a sudden everything's folded back, and no matter what you did with those people, you're going to be still in the same space. You can kind of think of them as kind of a choke point or something on a map. Everybody's got to go through that choke point. It's just a matter of what happens on the other side at that point. And as you can see, this is still pretty much the best commercially successful one, because it doesn't have those intricacies and kind of accounting that you have to do with a branching story, but it can still satisfy that emotional response, almost to the point of a really well written linear story. The emergent narrative is probably the hardest one to do, because this can actually have probably the least satisfactory endings. I'm going to give you an example of, say, something like The Sims. There's probably nothing that's truly emergent narrative out there, but Sims is probably about as good as you get. So a lot of people interact, and then what happens when they interact. And so you can have NPCs, but you can have also other people in the game. And if you've ever played The Sims, you can have these kind of really funny and unique experiences, or you can end up vacuuming your house for 24 hours. Obviously the latter is not exactly an emotionally impactful game. There's no passion in it. There's always a danger there that you have to worry about. One of the things that designers and developers agree on, probably more than anything else, is that whenever you give a large population your game, inevitably somebody will play it in a way that you totally didn't expect they'd play it. And the same thing here for story. If you give them any way to walk with this, essentially somebody's going to come up with a way that you didn't foresee, and maybe your game engine can't handle. So I probably, if you're new to this field, I wouldn't suggest emergent until you get a lot of practice doing the other ones. But trying a branching, fold back, yeah, go for it. Okay, now when we have this kind of good way of how we're going to employ our writing, then we have to think about how often we're going to do it. Because if you give it every second, I remember I played one game where they made on purpose this one character who annoyed you. So every 2 steps you take, they bother you, and they ask you a question. Then you take another 2 steps, they ask a question, another 2 steps, ask a question. I think the goal of that whole exchange was for you to try to get you to kill this person, because it was an RPG, and so in that case it was kind of funny, but you wouldn't want to write a whole game like that where every 2 seconds you're running into a piece of narration. At the same time, you don't want to just do a dump at the end of each of your chapters. In fact, I'm not going to say the name of this game, but there was one game that had, I think it was a 19-minute or an 18-minute cutscene at the end of one of its chapters. and the reason why I'm not saying this is I don't want anybody writing in saying, no, it was only 14 and a half minutes. But it was long. And the majority of people that they tested found did not go through the entire movie. They went and got a cup of coffee or they tried to get out of the game, hit Control Alt Delete. It was a nightmare. And it's actually an adventure game, which if you know anything about adventure games and adventure game players, those are probably the most patient of all gamers that exist. But nobody really wanted to do it because, I'm going to harp on this a little more. One of the problems was that the voice actors in there were kind of classically trained, so they were very slow to speak, and so that you knew exactly what they were saying every time, and for an 18-minute period, you don't care. You don't care what they're saying. I don't care how much inflection they use. So you want to go for some type of granularity that's in between. Constant, not making the player feel like, ooh, is something wrong? Why isn't the game engine working? And why isn't it giving me any more of the story? So something kind of continuous, but in kind of nice bite sizes as well. The next question that comes from that is, well, how am I going to do that? Well, here's a couple of different ways. The easiest, or I guess maybe even the longest way of doing it is probably the last bullet, as a drama, where the player can't control anything. They're going to get pulled away. Older games did this. Newer games have tried this with, I don't know, good and bad pieces, but it's a hard one to pull off because most gamers want control. I mean, let's face it, that's why we're not at a movie theater today. That's not why we're watching YouTube or TV, because we want to have some type of interaction. So probably the better ones is going to be the Journey, which again, this one's been around for a while. And like we were talking about before, I hit a bridge. Oh, look. Well, all of a sudden a cutscene comes in, a guy walks over the bridge and tells me a piece of the story. I conquer a town, let's say, in a strategy game. Oh, window pops up on my screen and the emperor of some other country gets mad at me and says, I'm going to war with you now. Something like that. Which allows the player to control the place, but they're not doing it explicitly. And as you can see, usually you can't go back. And to be honest, the reason you usually can't go back is because the programmers won't let you go back. Because that, again, there's always that chance, as if you can go back, that you can hit that trigger again, and you can reignite the story engine to tell you the same exact story over and over again. My favorite way is probably the top button, which is Challenger Choices, which I think is probably the most interactive of these three. Fighting somebody, determining, and at the end of that, determining whether to kill him or, take them on, who you choose to fight versus who you choose to walk away from. As you can see, it's a common method of plot advancement. And the one thing I will want to make sure you understand here is that you can use these in conjunction with each other. So just because you say, well, I'd really like to do it mostly as challenges and choices. Cool. But that doesn't mean you have to get rid of the journey part. Journey can still fit into it. And there's sometimes you will have to put somebody on a rail to make sure that you hit that common point, because again, if you're doing a fold back, you can't let them challenge your choice into the fold back. Ultimately, the fold back has to push them in that direction or drag them, kicking and screaming sometimes in that direction. Now, the last thing I'll talk about is the practice of doing this. So now you know kind of what type of story you're going to use, how you're going to introduce it. You've at least thought it out. You have a basic mantra, let's say, of that. Okay, we're going to do a fullback, and we're going to use mostly choices to develop the characters and whatnot. Now it's time to actually do some practice on it. First thing, script. You can script it out just like a movie. The difference is that we have to worry about interaction. So I just went to good old Wikipedia for this one, but basically what you want to do is create a dialogue tree. So what is a dialogue tree? Well, here's a very simple form of it. You have two branches that come off, and granted you can have like a multiple choice list, somewhere where the player is probably going to have to use their down arrow or their enter button or something of that nature to pick between different choices, and a lot of times it will come straight to the screen in the terms of text. So if it's going to come to the screen in terms of text, why not script it out as text? And then make up a simple tree like this where you have two choices. But again, like I said, you can have 4 choices, you can have 5 choices. But the problem with 5 choices is now when you get to this choice, you might have 5 more. And so if it's 5 up here and then 5 for each one, now all of a sudden you have 25 different pieces that go off in 25 different ways. So just like the fold back story, we can do a fold back on the dialogue tree, or we can just keep it simple and just say, well, you got 1 of 2 ways. Okay, 1 of 2 ways is going to give you 2 choices, then it's going to give you 4 choices, and then in this case it doesn't give you more 8 choices, but it could. The fold back would be what's happening here. See, notice how this arrow goes around and comes back to this spot. Well, that works good. Notice how these 2 arrows go to the same exact spot. That means we ultimately only have 2 places you can go. Sometimes it's a little unrewarding for the player, mostly because they know, well, no matter which way I answer, I'm going to end up in 2 spots. You know, they want at least to have the belief that there's a whole bunch of different ways it can go. So I would suggest that you start off with 2, that you end up with more than 2. Even if it's slightly different, just enough to make them feel like they have a little bit of control. I know I'm playing a game right now where, like, okay, well, I might as well just say it. One of the games I'm playing now is King's Bounty. Older game, not too old. I mean, it's less than 15 years old. But it has these nice dialogue trees like that. But a lot of times they fold back into, you're going to fight this guy no matter what. And when that happens, it's a little less enjoying. I'd really like to be able to do it the peaceful way, or maybe pay this guy off, or something like that. I just want that available to me. I don't necessarily not want to fight this guy, but because maybe I do. Giving at least the illusion of multiple choices is going to be good, and it's also going to allow for more replayability of your game. So if somebody really loves it, they're going to go in and replay it again, and obviously they're not going to buy a new game when they replay it, but your reputation gets really good when someone says, hey, I played this game like 4 times and I still love it. Okay, so let's get back to this. All this, well, let's fold this all back into the game engine. Those choices, if you looked at them, in fact, maybe let's go ahead and bring them back up real quick. These types of choices, guess what this is? This is just an if-then statement. If this, do this, else do this, right? That's it. Going into, no matter what programming language you have, you will have an if statement associated with this, or a case statement, or something like that, where all of a sudden you just have to pick between these different pieces. Piece of cake for programming, right? It gets a little extensive sometimes, but this is just a simple if structure. And this can all be put in your game engine, and it doesn't necessarily have to be an explicit storytelling engine at that point. Okay, so I'm going to stop it here, and then I'm going to give just a brief video next on characters in